Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations. The Catholic media outside of Italy has paid little attention to an interesting story that broke late last week. The story revolves around the case of Emanuele Orlandi, who was the daughter of a Vatican employee who disappeared in 1983 under mysterious circumstances. The story has fascinated traditionalists and Vatican observers who are aware of allegations that among certain prelates in the Roman Curia, there are a coterie of men devoted to Satan, and not in a metaphorical manner like secularists who openly praise Satan claim to be doing. These men, these members of the Roman Curia, it is said, are quietly in service to Satan and fully are aware of what it is they're doing. They quite literally worship him. That's the allegation anyway. And this one involves Emanuele Orlandi, and it's pretty simple. For 40 years, it's been alleged that the young girl disappeared and was a sacrificial offering made by these evil clergymen to Satan. Sounds outlandish, right? Something like Hollywood or something. But the story's persisted, and I covered it in 2018 or 2019, a development in that story, and it ended up going nowhere. Now we have a new development. Her brother, Pietro Orlandi, had a meeting with Francis, and as the story goes, Francis listened attentively to him for 8 hours. Pietro Orlandi wants the Vatican to open up about everything they know about the case, including the allegations of the worship of the infernal, all of it. The story is interesting to say the least, and I was surprised that no one outside of Italy decided to talk about it. What makes it more interesting is that Archbishop Viganò weighs in on the story as well, and I have his very short letter on the subject at the end of today's episode for you. So to make what you're about to hear abundantly clear, the accusation goes like this. Essentially, Pietro Orlandi, who is the brother of the late Emanuele Orlandi, who disappeared in 1983, accuses basically every pope, including John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, of hiding the truth, and implies rather heavily that John Paul II was actually involved in this himself. Mehmet Ali Agca, the man who famously tried to take out John Paul II on the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981, who converted to Catholicism in the late 2000s, denies this and takes rather big personal umbrage with that story and defends John Paul II on this. And Archbishop Viganò actually agrees with Mehmet Ali Agca. The story comes from News.Italy24, an English-language Italian news site. And by English language, I mean they literally run their articles through Google Translate from the original Italian and then post them in broken English. They're barely comprehensible, so I'll have to do some interpreting here for you. I'll have links posted in my show notes at returntotradition.org in today's post as usual. The headline is, What is the Truth? Il Tempo. We have interesting developments because it turns out that the man who tried to, shall we say, take out John Paul II back in 1981 decided to speak up, and he has called into question the official story about the case as told by Benedict XVI, John Paul II, and Francis, though he does back John Paul II on this. Now, I know you might want to take Ali Agca's allegations in all of this with a huge grain of salt because he's a notorious villain. But it's worth noting that Mehmet Ali Agca, the man who tried to end John Paul II in 1981, says he converted to Catholicism, as was widely reported in 2009. You're free to make of that what you will, though it is worth noting here that he has expressed doubts about the official Vatican line in the case. Here's the pertinent information about Pietro Orlandi and his meeting with Francis. From the Italian article, quote, Pietro Orlandi, brother of Emanuele Orlandi, was listened to for more than 8 hours in the Vatican by Alessandro Didi, promoter of justice commissioned by Pope Francis to shed light on the story of the young Vatican citizen who disappeared on the 22nd of June, 1983. A meeting strongly desired by Peter himself, who was listened to as a, quote, person informed of the facts, and during which 40 years of mysteries and silence were reconstructed. Peter, meaning Pietro, was able to, quote, verbalize all the things of which he spoke. Quote, I talked about the negotiation, the documents on the transfer of London, the very high prelates involved in Ted McCarrick problems, the famous screenshots, meaning of indecent material. Orlandi declared visibly tried that he found, quote, a lot of availability. The very fact of having told me that the assignment came directly from the Pope means something. He was told not to give anyone discounts, he added, and if there are responsibilities even at the top, those must come out. I'm going to interject here. That means Francis told them to leave no stone unturned on this. Anyway, on the Vatican's table, Emanuela's brother left a written note saying the people who should be listened to: Cardinal Re, the former commander of the Vatican Gendarmerie, Gianni Pignatone. The investigation, he later recalled, started in January, but they've been questioning people for a long time. They have good documentation, meaning there's a lot of evidence here. The positive thing is that today I saw the willingness to clarify as much as possible. An important moment because this must lead to something now. The things that I have verbalized must now necessarily have answers." End quote. The article goes on to describe Ali Agha's involvement. An anonymous caller with an Anglo-Saxon accent that the media misidentified back in 1981 as an American claimed he had the girl and demanded Ali Agha's release from jail as a condition of her release. That, of course, never happened, and Agha denounces the attempts to smear John Paul II that have since come out. Modernists who wish to, in their own mind, reform the Church's teachings on all manner of things, but mostly on the sins of the flesh and the sins that James Martin and the world are keen on having normalized, have tried to blame John Paul II for the huge Ted McCarrick problem among the especially American and European clergy going back several decades. Ali Agha wants, of course, nothing to do with that. Again, this is the man who tried to end John Paul II, who then converted to Catholicism in jail. I'm going to mostly quote him here. The translation is both clunky and, frankly, it's way too spicy for YouTube. On the screen, you will see the original text, but I'll read a clearer and, we'll say, cleaner version of his response to dragging John Paul II into this. Ali Agha says, quote, "He dismisses the accusation that John Paul II tried to cover for the Ted McCarrick problem. For him, these are, quote, terrible and horrible accusations that must end with the immediate release of Emanuela and Mirella. Otherwise, poor John Paul II, an honest and innocent man, will be peddled in the world as the saint of Satanism. There is no violence and no Ted McCarrick problem, they will say. Just Vatican justice and Italian justice must not disturb anyone with defamatory accusations of these kind of evil deeds." End, mostly quote. In short, you have Pietro Orlandi, the brother of the young woman who disappeared in the Vatican 40 years ago, under strange circumstances, placing the blame for the lack of a real investigation at the feet of the last three popes, including Francis, and he's asking Francis to come clean with that information. Now, to his credit, Francis reportedly spent a great deal of time with him that day in private conversation, and we mean like 8 hours of the day. But what will come from this? Probably not much, to be honest with you. The story isn't going to get resolved on this side of the general judgment, most likely. That seems to be Archbishop Viganò's opinion. He, as much as states that Francis not only listened to Mr. Orlandi because he was himself covering for the men involved, who would be his allies today if they were still around, and their ideological and spiritual children certainly are his allies, at least according to Viganò. Here is his short letter on the subject, which was published by Marco Tossati over at his website. In recent days, the statements of Pietro Orlandi, brother of Emanuela Orlandi, the daughter of an employee of the prefecture of the papal household, who disappeared in 1983, were released. This painful story requires the truth about Emanuela's end to be brought to light through rigorous investigations. Respect for family members and justice impose it, but the family's request for truth is entirely legitimate. The very serious insinuations of her brother, Pietro, about John Paul II's sound totally unacceptable and unheard of, which he says are based on the statements of Dr. Alessandro Didi, promoter of justice of the Tribunal of Vatican City-State, who would have told Pietro Orlandi, quote, that he had received a mandate from the Secretary of State and from Pope Francis to clarify 100% and to investigate at 360 degrees and not to discount anyone from the base to the top. In this way, Bergoglio insinuates that his predecessors, too, would be involved in the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi, that they would be implicated, and that they covered up these horrible events, while acknowledging himself as a person of integrity and determined to do justice. If the statements of Emanuela Orlandi's brother are true, the promoter of justice has committed a very serious violation of his duties of confidentiality to which every magistrate is bound. Faced with such despicable utterances, the Holy See should have intervened promptly, and the removal of Dr. Didi should have been immediate. The fact that this did not happen shows that the promoter of justice acts in execution of orders received, quote, from the Secretary of State and from Pope Francis, and that he enjoys the support of Bergoglio. Otherwise, the dissemination of unfounded accusations and cowardly insinuations about Pope Wojtyla, that would be John Paul II, accompanied by raving reconstructions made by multiple offenders, could not be explained. By unloading all responsibilities on his predecessor, Bergoglio evidently intends to divert the attention of the media from the horrible scandals that see him involved together with unworthy personalities present in the Vatican or promoted by him in the episcopal sees. The deafening silence of the Holy See and of the Italian Episcopal Conference demonstrates a disturbing complicity in this shameful operation on the part of those who, beyond the proclamations, have surrounded themselves with despicable and morally compromised characters, guaranteeing them protection and impunity. Signed, Carlo Maria Viganò, Archbishop, 14th of April, 2023. Okay, so is that clear? Not exactly, but what it basically looks like is that Viganò agrees with the Ali Aga, essentially, and that John Paul II should be left out of the conversation. What we know is that the accusation is that the young girl was taken for the offering by men pretending to be cardinals of the Catholic Church and an offering to Satan. They officially held the office, but of course, men like that can't actually be Catholic to begin with. And then after being used by them in a, we'll call it a Ted McCarrick-type manner that is too horrible to describe here, they offered her up to Satan. These men were so highly placed in the Vatican that they were able to hide away what they had done easily enough by themselves, and their successors in their offices either willingly or unwittingly kept the ruse going long after they left their offices. We don't have names, unfortunately, of those alleged to have done this, but the Vatican's silence for 40 years is honestly strange, and it's really strange how this story keeps turning up in the Catholic media in Italy. A simple Google search of her name shows articles every few years with new leads in the story that end up going virtually nowhere. It's a story that will simply not end. But I'm curious what you think of this. So let me know in the comments, please. Do you think John Paul II was complicit in this? Do you agree with Pietro Orlandi on that? Do you agree with Mehmet Ali Aga on that and Archbishop Viganò that essentially this is, well, an attempt to slime John Paul II when he can't defend himself, which is nothing new coming from Rome these days, sadly. Let me know what you think. Do you think there's more to this, that the accusations of organized service to Satan made by Malachi Martin in the 1990s, by many people in the decades since then, if there's truth to this? Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps as well. So always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.